All right, without ado, Bob Cruickshank Jr. Get him, Bob.
Thanks, David.
Preach on, brother.
Good morning. Good morning, Bereans. I always wanted to say that. Okay, we're going to continue our look at Revelation chapter 8, and we left off with verse 8. It says, "The second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was hurled into the sea. And a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the creatures that were in the sea and had life died, and a third of the ships were destroyed." Revelation 8, 8 through 9. Now, with regard to this passage, Rob Phillips states, "It's probably best not to mix and match symbolic and literal interpretations when it comes to the imagery in passages like this. A consistent view, either symbolic or literal, may be wrong, but a mixing of both views is almost certainly an error." But the question is why? Why would this be in error? Why are interpreters so against the idea that the literal mixes with the symbolic? In our previous message, we saw that it's a false dichotomy to pit the metaphoric against the literal because they both go hand in hand in any language. For example, consider my own sentence right here. I use the phrases previous message and false dichotomy, both very literal expressions, right? But I also use the phrase pit against. Taken literally, that comes from rather disgusting and disturbing practice where animals are put into a pit to fight against each other. I used it here in the sense of pitting the metaphoric against the literal, but metaphoric expressions don't literally fight against literal expressions, and there's no literal pit involved. And everyone here understands what I mean because we all understand what the idiom means. I also used another idiom, hand in hand, but languages don't literally have hands, and again, we all know what I mean. And no one can look at this sentence and say that I'm speaking either metaphorically or literally because I'm doing both. We do it all the time, often subconsciously without even realizing it, and the biblical writers do it too. And we saw that in the last message with the Psalms and even with Jesus himself in Matthew 24. The truth is, the use of metaphor is inescapable, which is another metaphor, by the way. We're not trying to escape from anything when we're stringing a sentence together, and we often string literal statements and metaphoric statements together in the same sentence. And right there, I just did it again. My use of the word string is a metaphor. And I keep pointing all of this out because I want you to see that it's almost impossible to communicate without using metaphors side by side with very literal statements. Consider Aristotle, for example. Aristotle was no fan of metaphor. In fact, he said he disdained it. He favored things like dry rhetoric and straight logic instead. But even Aristotle, who disdained metaphor, had to use a metaphor to explain his disdain for metaphor. He said that while he admired the masters of metaphor, Aristotle considered metaphor to be merely the seasoning on the meat and not the meat itself. And did you catch what he just did there? He just used a metaphor. There's no actual seasoning or meat involved in the writing process, unless, of course, you're writing a cookbook, but that's another story. My point is that despite his dislike of metaphor, even Aristotle had to use a metaphor to make his point, and that's exactly what John's doing here in Revelation 8:8. He's using a metaphor to make his point. He's using a metaphor about a burning mountain, and his metaphorical point is the idea that apostate Israel had become the new Babylon. But in order to see this, we have to become familiar with the Old Testament, as John expects us to be. Specifically, we have to become familiar with the prophet Jeremiah, who had a lot to say about Babylon. And in Jeremiah 51:25, he has this to say about Babylon. "Behold, I am against you, O destroying mountain that destroys the whole earth, declares the Lord. And I will stretch out my hand against you, and roll you down from the rocky cliffs, and I will make you a burnt out mountain. So, Babylon's called a destroying mountain, and God's going to turn it into a burnt out mountain. And notice what Jeremiah says a little later in the chapter in verses 41 through 42 about this burnt out mountain. He says, Babylon's become an object of horror among the nations, and the sea has come up over Babylon, and she's been engulfed by its roaring waves. Now, does that sound familiar? It should, because it sounds an awful lot like Revelation 8:8, a burning mountain engulfed by the sea. And the irony here that really shows the metaphorical nature of the language here is that Babylon wasn't a mountain at all. Babylon was located on the fertile plain of lower Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and not on any mountain. So the question is, why is Babylon even described as a mountain in the first place? And Bible Hub does a really nice job answering that question. It says, in the Tanakh, a mountain often symbolizes a kingdom or dominion. Mountains convey durability, loftiness, and geopolitical strength. Thus, Babylon, though situated on a flat Mesopotamian plain, stands metaphorically as a towering mountain. So, in the Old Testament, Babylon is the burning mountain that's thrown into the sea. And beginning in chapter 14 of Revelation, John's going to start identifying Jerusalem as the new Babylon in chapters 14, 16, 17, and 18. And the last reference to Babylon in the book of Revelation echoes Revelation 8:8 like a bookend. Revelation 18:21 says, then a strong angel picked up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, so will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will never be found again. And notice that in both Revelation 8:8 and 18:21, this burning mountain or great millstone, which is Jerusalem, the new Babylon, is thrown into the sea, another metaphor. As just about everyone recognizes, the sea symbolized chaos in the ancient world, and we can see why. The sea's random, it's unpredictable, it's chaotic. So Jerusalem, the burning mountain, is plunged into chaos. That's what the imagery is conveying. And next, John gives us a picture of the chaotic results of Jerusalem's plunge. Again, he says, and a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. And here in verse 9, we have the metaphoric once again mixing with the literal, just like in our own language today. As Ken Gentry comments, this imagery involves a historical component reflecting the sea battles on various bodies of water during the Jewish war. And this is important because we have people like Charlie Campbell saying things like, this is too cataclysmic to be attributed to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. When did that ever happen in the events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem? Nothing like that has ever happened in recorded history. Well, history's recorded a lot of sea battles and a lot of shipwrecks, so I don't know where he's going with that, but I digress. The fact is, it did happen, it was recorded, and we just have to know the history. For example, Josephus speaks of a great number of Jews who escaped out of Judea while Vespasian was in Caesarea. And these Jews fled to Joppa, which had been left desolate by Cestius as their new place of refuge. Now, Joppa was a port city about 35 miles northwest of Jerusalem and 30 miles south of Caesarea. And you might remember it from the book of Acts. It's where Peter was when he raised Tabitha from the dead in Acts chapter 9. And it's also where Jonah fled to get on a boat and sail away when the Lord told him to go to Nineveh. And if you recall, things didn't go well for Jonah there, and things didn't go well for the first century Jews who fled to Joppa either. Josephus says, because the region had been so laid waste in the war and wasn't capable of supporting them, they determined to go off to sea. And Josephus says they built numerous small ships and turned to piracy along the coasts of Syria, Phoenicia, and Egypt. Basically, they tried to survive by seizing the goods of other ships and then returning to their safe haven in Joppa. Now, when Vespasian got news of this, he wasn't all too happy, and he sent troops to attack the city by night. And when his forces arrived in Joppa, the Jews in Joppa fled to their ships and anchored offshore. But at dawn, Josephus tells us, a violent north wind arose, driving their vessels against one another and onto the sharp rocks. Josephus records that thousands perished by drowning, by shipwreck, and by some even taking their own lives, until the sea was red with blood and the shore was littered with corpses. Josephus describes the ships being dashed to pieces against the rocks and speaks of a great many shipwrecks. And his description here of these great many shipwrecks and the blood-red sea off the coast of Joppa reads like a commentary on Revelation 8 through 9. With that said, Josephus speaks of another instance which also reads like a commentary on Revelation 8 through 9. This one took place on a lake off the shores of Capernaum. And interestingly, Josephus notes how this particular lake was known for its abundance of Corazon fish. Now, this fish was considered a delicacy, and this fish was Capernaum's major source of income. And remember, in Revelation 8:9, John talks about the fish also dying in these sea battles, and the loss of this fish would have been a major hit to the major industry in Capernaum. Now, describing the battle itself, Josephus says the Jews' ships were small and fitted only for piracy, so they were no match for the Romans' larger ships. As such, the Jewish pirates would try to get close enough to the Roman ships so they could throw stones at the Romans, according to Josephus. And this resulted in the Romans leaping onto the Jews' ships with their swords in hand, slaying the Jews and destroying their ships. And he goes on to talk about the lake being all bloody and full of dead bodies, a very sad sight, he calls it. And the shores, he says, were again full of shipwrecks. And again, all of this echoes what John said in Revelation 8. A third of the sea became blood, a third of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. So the metaphoric mixes with the literal as the burning mountain of apostate Israel is plunged into a sea of chaos, and there really was chaos at sea with bloody battles, numerous shipwrecks, and massive loss of life. And next, we transition back to a metaphor in verses 10 through 11, where John says, "The third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch. And it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The star's name wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the waters because they were made bitter." Now, wormwood's become somewhat popular in pop culture based on its use in pop prophecy. We hear about it in songs, we read about it in books, and we see it in movies. And of course, it's all fiction, but so is the pop prophecy on which the fiction's based. Case in point, Calvary Chapel's Chuck Smith in the late 1970s. Smith was convinced that the wormwood prophecy would find its fulfillment in the passing of Halley's Comet in April of 1986. He claimed the combination of a depleted ozone layer and debris from the comet's tail would wreak atmospheric havoc on those left behind after the rapture. And that was obviously pure fiction. April of 1986 has come and gone along with Halley's Comet, and we're all still here. We're all still here with no rapture and no Armageddon. But April of 1986 wouldn't see the end of the speculation regarding this chapter in Revelation. In that same month of that same year, reactor number 4 blew at the Chernobyl nuclear site in Ukraine. Now, Ronald Reagan was familiar with Revelation 8, and when he learned that Chernobyl is the Ukrainian word for wormwood, he was certain the disaster at the reactor was a portent of Armageddon. But the radioactive dust of Chernobyl had about as much to do with Revelation 8 as the dust in the tail of Halley's Comet, meaning nothing. Again, it was all pure fiction. But with that said, let's fast forward like a comet to more recent times and more end times fiction, this time from John MacArthur. Shortly before he passed away, MacArthur gave a sermon on Revelation 8 titled The Coming Ecological Destruction. And he opened the sermon by bemoaning all the people trying to save the planet, and this was because he was absolutely certain that God was about to destroy the planet with an asteroid or a meteor based on Revelation chapter 8. And to support his view, he reminds his audience that movies have been made about this sort of thing. Now, I call this the Hollywood hermeneutic, interpreting Scripture in light of feature film. Basically, MacArthur's saying to get our theology from something like a Bruce Willis movie. If you remember, in the movie, a giant asteroid is on a collision course with the Earth, and Bruce Willis drills a hole in the asteroid, plants a bomb in it, and splits it in two before it gets to the Earth, and the name of the movie is Armageddon. So we can see how pop prophecy affects pop culture and vice versa. In other words, they both play off each other, but neither has anything to do with biblical prophecy or the biblical Armageddon. Now, MacArthur, of course, would disagree, saying, quote, "The prophecy of Revelation 8 is exactly what Scripture says it could be, a meteor," end quote. But Revelation 8 says nothing about a meteor. Wormwood is a star, and a star isn't a meteor or an asteroid. It's a star, but I digress. MacArthur continues with the Hollywood hermeneutic. He says, the world's going to track it. They're going to be able to see it. They're going to know it's coming. It's going to be on television, and people will be helpless and hopeless in stopping it. So this is supposedly what Revelation 8 is all about. It's about people watching an asteroid hitting the Earth on their television sets. And speaking of television sets, Skywatch TV's Thomas Horn took this all a step further and said, this wouldn't be just any old asteroid. In his book, The Wormwood Prophecy, NASA, Donald Trump, and a Cosmic Cover-Up of End-Time Proportions, Horn identifies wormwood as the asteroid Apophis, currently being tracked by NASA. Now, Horn claimed this revelation came to him in a terrifying dream he had about an asteroid hitting the Earth. When he woke up, Horn said he heard the word Apophis being whispered through his bedroom that morning, and that's when he put two and two together. Apophis is really wormwood. Now, looking at the title of Horn's book, you might be wondering how Donald Trump fits into all of this. Well, according to Horn, Trump's surrounded by a faith community of prophecy believers, and he's wisely allowed his ear to be attuned to some of the things they're telling him. Seeing the connection between Revelation 8 and the planet's fate, Horn says Trump has prudently taken action to minimize the impact of the asteroid. As it turns out, Space Force isn't really about space exploration at all. According to Horn, it's really an elaborate asteroid deflection system, and it's designed to curtail the destruction that Apophis, aka wormwood, is bringing to our planet as prophesied in Revelation 8. But of course, if Trump was truly prudent and truly wise and truly following the Hollywood hermeneutic, he'd just hire Bruce Willis to drill a hole in the asteroid, but apparently he's never seen the movie. Now, evangelist Jimmy Evans takes this all a step even further and gives us a doomsday date. Tracking on Horn's theory, Evans argued that if Apophis is the fulfillment of the wormwood prophecy, Revelation chapter 8, then that would happen in the middle of the Great Tribulation period, a period of 7 years according to them. Now, don't forget, the church is going to get raptured prior to this 7 years according to their calculations. And according to NASA's calculations, the date for Apophis hitting the earth is April of 2029. So April of 2029 would be the middle of the Great Tribulation period if all of this is true. Adjusting for the date and factoring in the fact that wormwood, aka Apophis, will hit in the middle of the tribulation, Evans did some calculations of his own. 3.5 years earlier would mean the rapture would occur in October of 2025, according to Horn. And once again, we have the addiction to pop prophecy fiction. Just like April of 1986, October of 2025 has come and gone with no rapture. And as it turns out, NASA reports that asteroid Apophis will safely miss the Earth by at least 20,000 miles in April of 2029. So unfortunately for them, no Armageddon either. And I went through all of that because the wormwood prophecy is one of those prophecies that they'll point to and say, when did that happen in AD 70? Which is sort of ironic because we can point to it and say, when did that happen in 1986 or 2025? It didn't. None of their predictions ever do, and none of their predictions ever come true. To date, pop prophecy has a 100% failure rate. And with that said, if Revelation 8 is a prophecy about nuclear weapons or asteroids, then no, that didn't happen in AD 70. But if it's a prophecy about events that were to happen soon in John's own time using biblical motifs and images of that time, then yes, it most certainly did happen. But we need to be familiar with our Bibles to see how it happened. Specifically, there's 3 things we need to be familiar with in the Bible regarding this verse. Again, John speaks of a star burning like a torch named wormwood. So let's take a look at how the word star is used in the Bible, how the idea of a burning torch is used in the Bible, and finally, how the word wormwood is used in the Bible. So first, what's the Bible referring to when it refers to stars? Well, first and foremost, the obvious one, it refers to the literal stars in the sky. And again, stars are stars. They're not asteroids. They're not meteors. Second, it can refer to angelic or spiritual beings in the unseen realm. And third, it can also refer to human beings as a way to signify an elevated position. For example, look at Obadiah 4, where the proud nation of Edom is told, though your nest is set among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. Now, obviously, the Edomites didn't really live in nests with the birds or up in the sky with the stars. Again, this is simply an expression meant to convey loftiness, superiority, and success. And if you think about it, we're not so different today. For example, we can speak of someone as a rising star in their field, an actress as a movie star, or a musician as a rock star. And just imagine someone 2,000 years from now reading our literature in a wooden literal fashion and stumbling on the phrase rock star. A rock isn't a star, and a star isn't a rock. They're 2 totally different things. But imagine that same person 2,000 years from now discovering that we use the word star to describe someone who's achieved a level of excellence, but then plugging that meaning into every single 21st century usage of the word star. Imagine, for example, plugging it into something like an astronomy text. That wouldn't make sense either. So, the person 2,000 years from now would need to avoid both of these extremes, and as students of the Bible, looking at our own 2,000-year-old text, we need to avoid both of these extremes as well. A star, which is a real thing up in the sky, can take on different nuances of meaning depending on the context where it's being used. And we want to be attuned to that context each time to determine the nuance and the meaning in that context. For example, consider the use of the term star in Daniel chapter 8, verse 10. Daniel says, "It grew up to the heavenly lights, and some of the lights, that is, some of the stars it threw, down to the earth, and it trampled them." Now, in context, the "it" that grabs the stars and throws them down is the little horn that comes from the goat in verses 8 and 9, which is all very metaphoric language, because verse 21 tells us that the goat isn't really a goat at all. It's the kingdom of Greece. And the little horn would be Antiochus Epiphanes from the kingdom of Greece. And with that said, Antiochus didn't literally reach up to heaven, grab a bunch of stars, and literally trample them, but he did literally seize control of the temple, oppress the Jewish people, and outlaw the Jewish religion. And if you read Maccabees, it was the Jewish leadership who invited him in. So the leadership was a bunch of sellouts, and it took a ragtag team of freedom fighters loyal to the Lord to undo the damage. And you can check that out in my article, Zechariah 12 and the Victories of the Maccabees, for more information on that. Our point here is simply that Daniel 8:10 is speaking about what happened to the Jewish people because of their failed leadership, and this is pictured as stars being thrown down to the earth. So that's what stars represent in a passage like this. In similar fashion, Jude speaks of the failed Jewish leadership of his day, saying, "These men are those who are hidden reefs in your love feast when they feast with you without fear, caring only for themselves clouds without water carried along by the winds, autumn trees without fruit, doubly dead and uprooted, wild waves of the sea, casting up their own shame like a foam, wandering stars, for whom the black darkness has been reserved forever." Jude 12 through 13. In contrast, Paul says this of true believers. He says, "Prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as stars in the world." Philippians 2:15. So, believers are portrayed as shining stars, whereas the apostate Jewish leadership's portrayed as wandering stars, as fallen stars, and as trampled stars. And all of this should help inform our thinking in Revelation 8:10, when John says a great star fell from heaven. And next, John says that this great star which fell from heaven was burning like a torch. And this again points to the Jewish leadership and the Jewish people if we know our Bibles. For example, Zechariah 12:6 says, "On that day I will make the clans of Judah like a blazing pot in the midst of wood, like a flaming torch among sheaves. And they shall devour to the right and to the left all the surrounding peoples, while Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in its place in Jerusalem." Isaiah said the same thing. Prophesying of Israel being restored after the exile, he said, "For Zion's sake I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not keep quiet. Her righteousness will go forth like brightness, and her salvation like a burning torch." Isaiah 62, verse 1. So, when God's people are victorious, they're like a burning torch, they're like a flaming torch, and this makes sense because, once again, we're not so different today in our own language. When we think of a flaming torch today, we think of glory, we think of success, we think of achievement. For example, pass the torch along, the torch of freedom, the Olympic torch, and so on. It's the same imagery that the Bible's using, and that's probably where we got it from to begin with. So, the Bible says that God's people are like a flaming torch when they're in the brightness of their glory and walking in obedience to Him. But when God's people were in rebellion and He sent them into exile, Jeremiah says, He cast down from heaven the glory of Israel in the day of His anger. Lamentations 2, verse 1. Now, obviously, the Israelites who were cast down from heaven weren't literally in heaven, and Jeremiah's language is similar to the star falling from heaven in Revelation 8, chapter 8. In short, if we allow the Old Testament to inform our thinking about the New Testament, then Revelation 8:10 makes perfect sense. It means the blazing torch of Israel's glory had become the fallen star of her judgment. And this fallen star that's burning like a torch has a name, and its name is wormwood. And to understand this, we shouldn't look to nuclear weapons, Hollywood movies, or even dreams people have about asteroids. We should look to the same place we look to get our information about burning mountains, falling stars, and blazing torches. We should look to the Bible itself to find our answer. And with that said, earlier we looked to the prophet Jeremiah to help us identify the burning mountain in verse 8. And as it turns out, he can also help us identify wormwood in verse 11. Jeremiah 23:15 says, "Therefore, says the Lord God of hosts, concerning the prophets," in other words, the leadership, "Behold, I am going to feed them wormwood and make them drink poisonous water. For from the prophets of Jerusalem," again, the leadership, "pollution has gone forth into all the land." Notice the idea here of poison and pollution in conjunction with wormwood, just like in Revelation 8. Amos said the same thing, telling the failed leadership of his day, "You've turned justice into poison and the fruit of righteousness into wormwood." And this is key to understanding the wormwood imagery. Solomon said that the mouth of the righteous and the teaching of the wise was a fountain of life in Proverbs 10:11 and 13:14. But the righteous man who gives way to the wicked is a muddied spring and a polluted fountain in Proverbs 25:26. So, the leadership, which should have been a righteous and wise fountain of life, had become a poisonous, muddy, and polluted fountain. That's what Jeremiah is tracking on with the wormwood imagery. That's what Amos was tracking on, and that's what John's tracking on in Revelation 8 with the same imagery. John's fallen star is a portrait of Israel's corrupt leadership being cast down in judgment. It's a picture of their once bright burning torch burning out and becoming poisonous wormwood for the people they misled. So John's not looking up into the sky with NASA. He's looking straight into the eye of the apostate leadership and pointing the scriptures straight at them. They would have been familiar with those scriptures and they would have gotten the message. And we need to be familiar with those scriptures as well if we're going to get the message. Wormwood isn't a trailer for the next end times blockbuster. Wormwood is the Bible's way to describe the poison of unfaithful, unjust, and unrighteous leadership. That's how Jeremiah used it, that's how Amos used it, and that's how John's using it right here in the book of Revelation. And next, moving on in the text, John says, "The fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars were struck, so that a third of them would be darkened. And the day would not shine for a third of it, and the night in the same way." Revelation 8:12. So we just saw that the fallen star poetically pointed to the downfall of the failed leadership, and that's what's going on here as well. John's continuing to use celestial language in a poetic way to target the failed leadership of his day. And the first celestial body he mentions in verse 12 is the sun. And 2 Samuel 23, 3 through 4 tells us that he who rules over men righteously, who rules in the fear of God, is as the light of the morning when the sun rises on a morning without clouds. This is what leadership is supposed to look like. This is what leadership looks like when it's functioning properly. This is what leadership looks like when the leaders are actually doing their job. It looks like the sun shining brightly on a morning without clouds. Now, let's take a look at the prophet Micah, who specifically targets Israel's leadership when it's not functioning properly. In Micah chapter 3, the prophet takes aim at the heads of the house of Jacob and the rulers of the house of Israel. Instead of ruling justly, Micah says they abhor justice. He says they twist everything that's straight. He says they build Zion with bloodshed and fill Jerusalem with injustice. He says her leaders pronounce judgment for a bribe, her priests instruct for a price, and her prophets divine for money. Yet they lean on the Lord, saying, "Is not the Lord in our midst? Calamity will surely not come upon us." Micah 3, verse 11. So that's what they're doing, and that's what they're saying. And what does the Lord say in response to this? He says, "Therefore, on account of you," meaning the corrupt leadership, "Zion will be plowed like a field, and Jerusalem will become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the temple will become like the high places of the forest, and you will go out of the city and dwell in the field and go to Babylon." Micah 3:12, verse 10. So this is what literally happened because of Israel's corrupt leadership. Leadership that was supposed to be shining like the sun. And with that in mind, now pay attention to how Micah poetically describes their downfall. He says, "The sun will go down over the prophets, and the day will become dark over them." Micah 3:6. So, once again, another Old Testament passage sounds an awful lot like Revelation 8. And once again, if John's readers were familiar with their Bible, if they were familiar with their Old Testament, John's words would sound familiar as well. The burning mountain, the falling star, the wormwood imagery, and the darkening of the sun should all sound familiar, and it all points to the leadership's failure. And the darkening of the moon would have pointed to this as well, especially in the first century, as the coins of the Herods featured the moon on what we would call the tail side of the coin. So the darkening of the sun, moon, and stars pictured the downfall of Israel's leadership as new leadership was beginning to dawn. Ken Gentry puts it this way. He says, Revelation's theological point here is that God is darkening the sky over Israel, whereas those whom they persecute, the Christians, are inheriting the new creation in which they will enjoy light, not from the sun, but from God and the Lamb. In other words, there's a role reversal coming up, and new leadership is about to take over. Now, regarding the current leadership, it talks about a third of the sun, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars being darkened. But according to Henry Morris, this isn't talking about the Jewish leadership at all. He says it's about angels reducing the gravitational forces in the sun's mass and shrinking it so that its light output will be slowed down. John MacArthur concurs. He says, God can do whatever he wants to do. He cranked it up, he can crank it down. The loss of solar heat, he says, will cause radical drops in temperature all over the earth. There will be a total interruption of the botanical and biological cycles, according to MacArthur. As that begins to change, he says, everything in the world starts to go mad. But what's truly mad and truly sad is making this passage about the literal sun. And the problem is, it's not just a third of the sun that we're talking about. It's a third of the moon and the stars. In verse 7, it's a third of the earth and the trees. In verses 8 and 9, it's a third of the sea, a third of the fish, and a third of the ships. And in verses 10 through 11, it's a third of the rivers, a third of the springs, and a third of the mountains. In other words, focusing on the sun alone and trying to figure out what would happen if the sun went out scientifically is to miss John's point completely. John's continued use of the one-third theme is simply meant to convey the idea that God's not finished yet. As Stephen Smalley comments, John uses the expression one-third insistently in this passage 12 times between verses 7 and 12. The fraction cannot be taken literally. It rather indicates that God's judgment is not yet final. And that's exactly what's going on in the passage. John's letting the reader know there's more trumpets to sound and more judgments to come. In other words, chapter 8's ramping up for what's coming up, as the final verse of the chapter says. Then I looked and I heard an eagle flying in mid-heaven, saying with a loud voice, woe, 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 because of the remaining blasts of the trumpets of the three angels who are about to sound. Revelation 8, verse 13. So this closes the chapter out. A picture of an eagle flying in mid-heaven, pronouncing the woes for the judgments to follow. And from a literary standpoint, this final verse of Revelation 8 is a dramatic bookend to the first verse. Remember, the chapter opened with absolute silence in heaven, except for the voice of God's people praying. And the chapter closes with absolute silence in mid-heaven, except for the voice of the lone eagle pronouncing the woes. And the opening and closing verses both employ animal imagery as well. Revelation 8 opens with the lamb breaking the seventh seal, and it closes with the eagle pronouncing the woes. The lamb pictures the Lord, and so does the eagle. Remember, when God took his people out of Egypt, he told them, I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself, Exodus 19:4. Here, the eagle represents the wings of deliverance, and John uses it this way later in chapter 12. But here in verse 8, the eagle represents the wings of judgment, and the Old Testament also uses the eagle imagery this way as well. Deuteronomy 28:29 says, the Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the end of the earth, as the eagle swoops down, a nation whose language you will not understand. And this happened with the Assyrians in 722 BC. It happened with the Babylonians in 586 BC. And it was about to happen again with the Romans in 70 AD. And the eagle imagery here takes on some real historical significance in terms of 70 AD. As my good friend Ian Paul writes, eagles were communicators of divine will in Roman culture and formed the insignia for the Roman legions. And Josephus informs us, then came the ensigns encompassing the eagle, which is at the head of every Roman legion, the king, the strongest of all birds, which seems to them a signal of dominion and an omen that they shall conquer all against whom they march. And then he says, these sacred ensigns are followed by the trumpeters. So once again, Josephus reads like a commentary on Revelation, as we have the eagle followed by the trumpets in Josephus, and we have the eagle followed by the final three trumpets in Revelation. And of course, Jesus said, wherever the corpse is, the eagles will gather, speaking of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. As Gentry puts it, the elevation of the ensign on Jerusalem's wall was the signal that the eagle had landed. So the eagle is a powerful image in Israel's history that took on a powerful historical embodiment in their history, but the eagle's cries still have a message and a meaning that's not lost on the pages of history. We have to ask ourselves, if that eagle were flying over our heads, would it be pronouncing woes against us because we're living our lives in a way that's displeasing to the Lord? Or would it invite us to mount up on its wings and soar, as Isaiah says, when he says, those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not be weary. They will walk and not grow faint. Isaiah 40, verse 13. Friends, that's who we want to be. We want to be the ones who mount up on the eagle's wings, not the ones whom it's pronouncing woes against. We want to be like the sun on a morning without clouds. We want to be godly leaders leading people to the Lord. We don't want to be like Israel's fallen leaders in the first century. Now, you might say, but I'm not a leader. But you are. We're all priests, we're all kings, and we're all children of the King. And we can either be fallen stars bringing wormwood to the world, or we can be shining stars bringing the water of life that frees the world. As Peter says, let's let that morning star arise in our hearts and be the people that God's called us to be. And again, if by chance anyone here or anyone listening online doesn't know the Lord, I just encourage you to come to know him and make him the Lord of your life. And then that morning star will rise in your heart and on the dark places in your life, and he will make things right in your life. Then he'll bear you up on the wings of that eagle and bring you to himself, and you'll run and not be weary, and you'll walk and not grow faint as you walk in fellowship with him, shining like the sun on a morning without clouds. And just a quick summary. First and foremost, remember, literalism mixes with symbolism. It's never an either or in the Bible or in any language, so we shouldn't treat the Bible any differently. With that said, the burning mountain is a symbol of apostate Israel, and that burning mountain really was plunged into a sea of chaos, literally and figuratively. Wormwood represents the poisonous teaching of the apostate leaders, and the sun, moon, and stars language symbolizes the leaders themselves and the failure of their leadership. And we don't want to be like them. We want to rise up and shine and be the leaders that, God has called us to be in this world. And with that, I just wanted to say, if you were here 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, I did Zechariah 14. We went through the chapter just like I did here, kind of like that verse-by-verse method. And by the way, I know I took a few jabs at John MacArthur, but David's talked about this a lot of times. John MacArthur was really, he influenced me too with the verse-by-verse teaching. So I like John MacArthur. I like his method of teaching. Don't agree with him about asteroids hitting the earth or the Hollywood hermeneutic. But anyway, so I basically took that same approach with Zechariah 14 when I was here, and those conference messages became part of this book. Gary does the first section. I do the second section. So my part was really born out of these conference messages, the same sort of method that I just went through Revelation 8. So those are available out on the table if you want to pick up a copy. And with that said, how am I doing? Am I good for questions, David?
Yeah, you got 10 minutes.
Okay.
Tell people how they can get your stuff. How can they find out about, you got stuff online, how do they get to it?
Oh, like I referred to that article, Zechariah 12, and the victories of the Maccabees. All the articles are platformed on Burroughs of Berea, and you just go to Cruickshank's Corner. So when you go to Burroughs, you'll see articles, and you hit that drop-down window, and Mike's there. You'll see the Sullivan Standard. You'll see Cruickshank's Corner and a couple other things. So you just, that's how you get it there. Plus, I think you should be able to just Google Cruickshank's Corner, and it'll come up. And if you do that, something else will come up. My friend Chuck Cody, it's Last Days Past is the website. And what I like about Chuck's website is it's kind of old school, where you have a list. Like as soon as you go to the page, bam, all the articles are there. I kind of like that. I'm like, I like the internet how it was back then, and I love the way Chuck has that set up, so you can really find anything. These, I'm sure, will become articles, the Revelation 8 messages, so those will be up. And then Chuck has them. You can go to Zechariah 14, subheading, because I have articles in there. This was kind of born out of those. The articles were born out of the conference message, and then all of that basically became this. This is the same and different than the conference messages in the articles. But so Burroughs of Berea, Last Days Past. A lot of my stuff's on American Vision. And my good friend Don K. Preston, it's donkpreston.com. He has a lot of my articles up there too. So, yeah. All right. Any questions, comments? Yes, sir.
So my understanding is that often the reference to the sea in Scripture refers to the Gentiles. So could the mountain being thrown into the sea be an analogy for the Jews being dispersed and absorbed by the nations?
I think that's a valid point. I think it could be. I know when it says she sits on many waters, the many waters are peoples, nations, tongues, and tribes, or something like that. So yeah, I think it could. I kind of take it just more or less as chaos, but I don't have a problem with that. And a lot of times, no, it's not talking about that. It's talking about this. I kind of have a both and approach to a lot of this stuff instead of an either or. And I can't remember the example he gives, but if you get Paradise Restored by David Chilton, it's in one of the early chapters. It's on how to read the Bible. And he goes through a verse and it talks about water, it talks about something else, and it talks about a few things. And David basically parsed it like, okay, when the Bible uses this term, what does it want you to think of? And he'll take you to a bunch of different verses where it's used, literally and symbolically, symbolically one way, symbolically another way. So I'm kind of paraphrasing what he did. So he said, which is it? And he's like, all of them. He's like, there's a lot packed into that. So I think you're probably right, and it's probably a both and as opposed to an either or. Yeah. But anything? Yes, sir.
As part of building just the basis of that imagery, I wanted to bring up that in Genesis 15:17, God's presence is a burning torch in the self-knowledge victory
Oh.
of Abraham, which is just a cool idea of the burning torch. But I think that's a different burning torch than the burning torch wormwood. But it's just a cool idea of the burning torch imagery.
Yeah, and I forgot I want to repeat these so the people at home can hear. He just brought up that with Abraham, there's the burning torch imagery there too, and that's good. And that kind of goes with what Chilton's saying. Okay, so when I put this message together, it's burning torch. So what do? I start combing through the Bible. Where's it talking about a burning torch? And I found those two references. But you can really, I'm sure there's more, and he just brought up one that I didn't think of. Who knows how many places it talks about. And by the time you get to the end of that book, like Chilton says, the biblical writer wants you to pull all this stuff together, because that's all sort of loaded into the image that he uses. So yeah, excellent observation. Anything else? Yes?
Well, we're called to be salt and light.
Yeah.
So we're supposed to be bearing the good torches.
Yeah. She just made the comment, we're called to be salt and light. So, and that's in the passages that I talked about, the torch was used in a good way. It's, when they're restored, when they're walking with the Lord, they're a flaming torch. And I think what John's trying to get across, that flaming torch is falling. Like they were, they returned from exile, they straightened things out. But by the time you get to the New Testament, they're screwing up again. So that blazing torch that they became when they were, repented of what sent them into exile, it's falling. It's like the fallen star. They're not what they should be anymore. Okay, anything else? So we're good? I think we're good, David. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.